The Battle of Prokhorovka is one of the most serious engagements of the Second World War, and certainly one of the most talked about battles on YouTube. Yet, it is also one of the most misunderstood. 2 years ago, I released a video that pushed Prokhorovka beyond the usual surface-level version of Kursk that most people know. Since then, the battle has become far more widely discussed online, but many of the details have been exaggerated, simplified, or repeated without scrutiny. Details matter. Over the past 2 months, I've revisited Prokhorovka through several major works and primary-based studies, and what emerges is a battle far more chaotic, costly, and grim than its popular reputation suggests. In some respects, it is worse than you think. In others, it is far less deserving of the title it is most famous for. Prokhorovka was not the largest tank battle in history, but it was one of the most destructive, compressed, and psychologically brutal. By the end of this video, you will understand what actually happened on that battlefield, why so many myths took hold, and how the reality of Prokhorovka differs sharply from the legend that surrounds it. Operation Citadel began on July 5, 1943, with one of the largest German armoured concentrations of the war. The objective was simple: pinch off the Kursk salient, encircle Soviet forces, and restore German momentum after Stalingrad. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, would drive north. Army Group Center would drive south. They would meet somewhere near Kursk and destroy everything between them. By 10 July, the northern attack had stalled. Army Group Center's model had advanced barely 12 kilometers against prepared Soviet defenses and was going nowhere. But in the south, Manstein's forces, particularly 2nd SS Panzer Corps under SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, had torn through Soviet defensive lines and were driving toward Prokhorovka. Hauser commanded 3 Waffen-SS divisions: 1st SS Panzergrenadier Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler unter SS Brigadeführer Theodor Wisch, 2nd SS Panzergrenadier Division Das Reich unter SS Gruppenführer Walter Krüger, and 3rd SS Panzergrenadier Division Totenkopf under SS Brigadeführer Hermann Pries. Between them, they fielded approximately 280 to 320 tanks and assault guns, far fewer than Soviet propaganda would later claim, but enough to punch through everything the Red Army had thrown at them so far. By 11th July, 2nd SS Panzer Corps had been in continuous combat for 6 days. Fuel was short, ammunition expenditure had exceeded projections, crew exhaustion was becoming a tactical problem, tanks were breaking down faster than field workshops could repair them, and the Soviets kept feeding in reserves. Prokhorovka mattered because it sat on key rail lines and road junctions southwest of Kursk. More importantly, it represented the last realistic opportunity for German forces to achieve a breakthrough before Soviet reserves made further advance impossible. Stalin and Stavka understood this. They ordered a counterattack. The Soviet response was massive. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating operations at Kursk, had held back strategic reserves specifically for this moment. 5th Guards Tank Army under Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov was ordered to concentrate southwest of Prokhorovka and destroy 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Supporting forces included 5th Guards Army under Lieutenant General Alexei Zhadov, elements of 1st Tank Army, and massed artillery. This was not a spoiling attack. This was intended to shatter German offensive capability. The terrain around Prokhorovka was a nightmare for armoured operations, and almost every popular account of the battle ignores this. The rail embankment running east-west through the area was nearly 3 meters high in places. Anti-tank ditches had been dug across likely approach routes. The Psel River to the north created a natural boundary that channeled movement. Balkas, steep-sided ravines cutting through the steppe, made cross-country movement difficult and predictable. Wheat fields reduced visibility to less than 100 meters in many areas. This was not open tank country. This was broken ground that forced armour into narrow corridors and eliminated the advantages of range, mobility, and coordinated manoeuvre. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass and shock. German doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination and superior gunnery at range. The terrain at Prokhorovka destroyed the conditions both sides needed to fight effectively. German reconnaissance reports from the 11th of July noted the ground was unsuitable for large-scale armoured operations. Soviet operational maps showed the same problems. Both sides attacked anyway. The wheat was particularly deceptive. It was high enough in early July, approaching 1 meter in places, to conceal hull-down tanks and anti-tank gun positions, but it also meant tank commanders couldn't see the ground they were moving over. Balkas and ditches appeared suddenly. Tanks bogged down in soft ground that looked solid from a distance. The wheat burned easily, and once fires started, the smoke reduced visibility to almost nothing. One Leibstandarte reconnaissance officer, in a report filed on the evening of the 11th of July, specifically noted that the terrain southwest of Prokhorovka favours the defender and restricts manoeuvre. He recommended against attacking across this ground. The recommendation was noted and ignored. Operational necessity overrode tactical good sense. Soviet engineers had done additional work in the weeks before Citadel. Anti-tank ditches were dug 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep across predicted German approach routes. These weren't continuous lines, that would have been too obvious, but staggered obstacles designed to channel armour into killing zones. Minefields covered the approaches to key crossings. Dummy positions drew fire away from real defensive works. The effect was to create a battlefield where neither side could operate as intended. German tanks couldn't use their range advantage because they couldn't see far enough. Soviet tanks couldn't execute deep penetrations because the ground restricted movement. What should have been maneuver warfare became a meeting engagement in close terrain, which favoured neither side but guaranteed high casualties. By the evening of the 11th of July, 2nd SS Panzer Corps had taken up positions southwest and south of Prokhorovka. Leibstandarte held the centre, astride the main road to Prokhorovka itself. Das Reich was positioned to the southeast. Totenkopf was fighting north of the Psel River, attempting to envelope Soviet positions from the flank. Leibstandarte's Panzer Regiment, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Georg Schönberger, reported approximately 40 operational tanks on the morning of July 12th. This included a mix of Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and a handful of Tigers. SS Sturmbannführer Joachim Peiper commanded 3rd Gepanzerte Bataillon of SS Panzergrenadier Regiment 2, an armoured battalion of Panzergrenadiers mounted in half-tracks. He was 28 years old and had been fighting on the Eastern Front since 1941. Divisional war diary entries from late June show he had already been recommended for the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross for actions during the approach to Kursk, though the award would not be confirmed until January 1944. His reputation among the Leibstandarte was built on speed and aggression. Prokhorovka would test both. SS Sturmbannführer Martin Gross commanded 2nd Abteilung of the Leibstandarte's 1st SS Panzer Regiment. At Prokhorovka, his battalion was responsible for a major portion of the division's armoured thrust. Post-battle reports provide some of the most detailed German accounts of the fighting, the battle as the most confused and costly engagement his unit had experienced since Kharkov. He would receive the Knight's Cross on 22nd July 1943, specifically for his actions at Prokhorovka on 12th July. Leibstandarte also fielded SS Obersturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, son of the German foreign minister, commanding a company in SS Panzer Regiment 1. Von Ribbentrop would receive the Knight's Cross in mid-July 1943 for his actions during the fighting. His company engaged Soviet armour south of Prokhorovka on 12th July, though exact numbers remain disputed. Das Reich fielded slightly more armour, approximately 50 tanks operational, but was spread across a wider front. SS Obersturmbannführer Christian Tüchsen commanded 2, Abteilung of Das Reichs Panzer Regiment. Tüchsen was an experienced tank officer who had fought in France, the Balkans and Russia. He had received the Knight's Cross on 31st March 1943 and would later receive the Oak Leaves in December 1943 for cumulative achievements during the year's fighting. At Prokhorovka, Tüchsen commanded from a command tank positioned behind the main fighting line, attempting to coordinate his companies by radio. According to his operations officer, radio communication began failing by mid-morning, forcing Tüchsen to move forward to physically locate his units and issue orders face-to-face. Totenkopf was in the worst position. Fighting north of the Psel meant marshy ground, limited routes of advance, and Soviet forces dug in along the river's southern bank. The division reported approximately 30 operational tanks. Crews were exhausted. One account from a Totenkopf tank commander recorded in post-war interviews described men falling asleep at their positions during brief lulls in the fighting. Engines were overheating, track links were failing, ammunition stocks were dangerously low. SS Hauptsturmführer Helmut Becker commanded a company in Totenkopf's Panzer Regiment. Becker had been awarded the German Cross in Gold in April 1943, a decoration recognizing sustained combat performance short of Knight's Cross level. At Prokhorovka, his company was tasked with supporting the crossing of the Psel. His company lost 4 tanks to mechanical breakdowns before even reaching the river. The remaining tanks crossed successfully but found themselves in marshy ground that limited their mobility to walking pace. Becker's after-action report noted that his company fought effectively in defensive positions but could not advance across the terrain north of the river. He would receive the Knight's Cross in September 1943 for his cumulative performance during the summer fighting. The Tigers deserve specific mention. 2nd SS Panzer Corps had approximately 35 Tigers in total infantry at the start of Citadel, distributed across the 3 divisions. By the evening of the 11th of July, only approximately 15 were operational. This is far fewer than popular accounts suggest. The Tiger I had an 88mm main gun capable of destroying any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Its frontal armour was effectively immune to the T-34's 76mm gun at combat ranges, but it was also slow, mechanically complex and fuel-hungry. At Prokhorovka, the Tigers would fight at ranges where their advantages evaporated. SS Untersturmführer Michael Wittmann was present with the Leibstandarter's heavy tank company. At Prokhorovka, Wittmann's Tiger engaged Soviet armour from prepared positions northwest of the town. Accounts credit him with multiple tank kills during the battle, though the chaotic nature of the fighting makes precise attribution impossible, and claims remain disputed. What is certain is that he survived. Wittmann's reputation as one of the war's most successful tank aces would be built primarily during later actions, particularly his famous engagement near Villers-Bocage in Normandy on June 13th, 1944. Wittmann's company commander, SS Hauptsturmführer Heinz Kling, positioned his Tigers in hull-down positions behind the rail embankment with clear fields of fire to the east. This was textbook defensive deployment. The Tigers would engage Soviet armour at maximum range, destroying as many tanks as possible before they closed to distances where Soviet numerical superiority mattered. In theory, this should have worked. In practice, smoke and dust reduced engagement ranges to a few hundred meters within the first hour of fighting. Another Tiger commander in Leibstandarte, SS Unterscharführer Franz Staudegger, had achieved notable success earlier in the Kursk operation. On August 8, 1943, near Teterevino during the early advance phase of Citadel, Staudegger's crew destroyed 22 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. He was awarded the Knight's Cross shortly thereafter for earlier actions during Citadel, making him the first Tiger tank commander to receive the decoration. At Prokhorovka itself on July 12th, Staudegger continued to fight effectively. In a 1970s interview, Staudegger described the fighting at Prokhorovka as not aimed shooting, but just firing at movement in the smoke. German tank crews by mid-July were not the same men who had begun Citadel. One panzer commander with Das Reich, interviewed decades later, described the period between 5 and 12th of July as 6 days that felt like 6 months. Crews were sleeping 3 to 4 hours per night. Rations were irregular. The constant vibration and noise inside a tank, combined with the stress of near-continuous combat, produced a kind of cumulative exhaustion that degraded reaction times and decision-making. Add to this the mechanical reality. German tanks in 1943 required extensive maintenance. Track tension needed constant adjustment, engines needed servicing, optics needed cleaning. None of this was happening properly because there was no time. Fuel was the critical problem. Panzer divisions were supplied by truck columns that had to navigate hundreds of kilometers of poor roads under threat of Soviet air attack and partisan activity. By the 11th of July, some units in the 2nd SS Panzer Corps were down to less than a quarter tank of fuel. This meant tanks could not maneuver freely, it meant reserves could not be repositioned quickly, it meant that even if German forces broke through at Prokhorovka, exploitation would be impossible. One Leibstandarte after-action report dated 13th of July stated bluntly, Continuation of offensive operations not possible due to fuel situation, crew exhaustion, and mechanical losses. This was written before anyone at corps level fully understood the scale of what had just happened. The Panzer IV, which formed the backbone of German tank strength at Prokhorovka, was a good tank, but not exceptional. The long-barreled 75mm gun could penetrate T-34 armour at reasonable combat ranges. The armour was adequate against Soviet 76mm guns at range, but vulnerable at close quarters. Reliability was acceptable if the tank received proper maintenance, which by 11th July was no longer happening. Crews reported chronic problems with final drives, engine overheating and track wear. The Panzer III was obsolete by 1943 standards, but still present in some companies. Armed with a 50mm gun, it could not reliably penetrate T-34 frontal armour, except at very close range. Panzer III crews at Prokhorovka were told to engage from the flank or use high-explosive rounds against infantry. Several were lost to T-34s that outgunned them. German assault guns, variants armed with 75mm guns, fought alongside the Panzers. These vehicles had low silhouettes and excellent frontal armour, but no turret, which meant limited traverse and vulnerability to flanking attacks. At Prokhorovka, assault guns were positioned in static defensive positions where their lack of a turret mattered less. They performed well in this role, with several crews claiming multiple Soviet tank kills. Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov commanded 5th Guards Tank Army. On the evening of July 11th, he received orders directly from Stavka. Attack at dawn on July 12th, destroy 2nd SS Panzer Corps, and prevent any further German advance toward Kursk. The pressure from Stavka and front headquarters was intense. Failure was not an option. Success would be rewarded. The subtext was clear. 5th Guards Tank Army was a formation that existed largely on paper as an elite unit, but was in reality a hastily assembled collection of tank corps, mechanized units, and supporting infantry. Rotmistrov had roughly 700 to 900 tanks and self-propelled guns under his command, though exact operational strength on July 12th remains debated. The corps striking force consisted of the 18th and 29th Tank Corps, supported by elements of the 2nd Tank Corps and 2nd Guards Tank Corps. Most of the tanks were T-34s and T-70 light tanks. There were some heavier KV-1 models, but not many. The 18th Tank Corps, commanded by Major General Vasily Bakharov, was supposed to deliver the main blow against Leibstandarte. Bakharov had combat experience dating back to 1941, but he had never commanded a formation this large in offensive operations. His corps consisted of 3 tank brigades and supporting units, on paper about 180 tanks. The actual strength on the 11th of July was closer to 150 after accounting for mechanical breakdowns during the approach march. The 29th Tank Corps under Major General Ivan Kirichenko was tasked with attacking Das Reich positions south and southeast of Prokhorovka. Kirichenko was an experienced officer, but his corps had been in almost continuous action since early July and was under strength. Tank strength reports from the 11th of July show the corps fielded approximately 120 operational tanks, not the 150 plus authorized strength. 2nd Guards Tank Corps, commanded by Major General Alexei Badeny, was Rotmistrov's reserve, and this formation was supposed to exploit whatever breakthrough the initial assault achieved. Badeny's corps was in better condition than the others. It had not been heavily engaged before Prokhorovka, but it also lacked coordination with the other tank corps. Badeny and his brigade commanders received their attack orders verbally on the night of the 11th of July, with minimal time to plan. The T-34 in mid-1943 was a good tank. It had sloped armour, a decent 76mm gun, wide tracks for cross-country mobility, and a low profile. It was also cramped, noisy, had poor visibility for the crew, and lacked a 3-man turret, which meant the commander had to double as gunner. Radio equipment was scarce. Many tanks lacked radios entirely and relied on visual signals, flags, flares, following the tank in front. Soviet tank crews in 1943 were a mix of veterans and replacements. The veterans, men who had survived 1941 and 1942, were competent but exhausted. The replacements were inadequately trained. Gunnery training in particular suffered. A T-34 crew might have fired 10 to 15 live rounds during training before being sent to the front. German crews often had months of training and significantly more live fire practice. This mattered. The plan Rotmistrov issued was doctrinally sound, but tactically insane given the terrain. 5th Guards Tank Army would attack in waves, smashing into the German positions with mass and speed. The first echelon would overrun German anti-tank defences. The second echelon would exploit the breakthrough. Infantry would follow the tanks and clear positions. It was shock tactics, Soviet doctrine at its most basic. The problem was that Rotmistrov had almost no time to coordinate the attack. Units were still arriving at their jumping-off positions on the night of the 11th of July. Some brigades had been force-marching for 2 days with minimal rest. Tank commanders received their orders verbally, often with no maps. Company and platoon leaders were told to follow regimental commanders and attack anything German. Brigade commander reports from the night of the 11th to the 12th of July describe confusion, inadequate fuel distribution, ammunition trucks arriving late, and crews sleeping in or under their tanks. One account from a Soviet tank company commander recalled being told, "Attack at dawn toward Prokhorovka, destroy enemy armour, do not stop." When he asked for clarification on routes, objectives, or coordination with neighbouring units, he was told there was no time. Soviet infantry support was equally problematic. Rifle divisions assigned to support the tank attack were exhausted from previous fighting. Many units were under strength. Coordination between tank and infantry commanders was minimal. The standard Soviet tactic, infantry advancing closely behind tanks, required tight coordination and mutual support. At Prokhorovka, there was neither. Rotmistrov's headquarters was several kilometers behind the front line. He would have almost no ability to influence the battle once it started. His staff officers knew this. Some of them later admitted in interviews that they expected heavy losses but believed mass would overwhelm the Germans. The phrase used in one account was acceptable losses. What constituted acceptable was never defined. The other issue was command and control. Soviet tank formations in 1943 relied heavily on rigid orders and centralized control. Once battle was joined, junior commanders had limited ability to adapt. German doctrine emphasized initiative at lower levels, what they called Auftragstaktik. A German platoon leader or even tank commander could make tactical decisions based on the situation in front of him. Soviet crews were expected to follow orders, advance, and attack. At Prokhorovka, this doctrinal difference would prove catastrophic. The Soviet artillery preparation before the attack was brief and ineffective. Several hundred guns fired for approximately 15 minutes, starting at 0800 hours. The barrage was intended to suppress German anti-tank defences and disrupt command and control. In practice, most shells fell on empty ground. German positions were either well camouflaged or located in areas Soviet intelligence had not identified. The barrage made noise but accomplished little. The attack began shortly after 0800 hours. Soviet accounts describe waves of tanks moving forward through the wheat field southwest of Prokhorovka. German accounts describe the appearance of Soviet armour as sudden and overwhelming despite the artillery preparation. The first echelon of 18th Tank Corps, approximately 200 tanks, advanced directly toward Leibstandarte's positions. The terrain immediately created problems. Tanks had to funnel through gaps between the anti-tank ditches and balkas. What was supposed to be a broad front assault became a series of columns moving along predictable routes. German anti-tank guns opened fire first. The 88mm flak guns, positioned in camouflaged emplacements, began engaging T-34s at ranges of 1,500 meters. Soviet tanks started burning before they were within effective range to return fire. One after-action report from a Leibstandarte anti-tank battery claimed 7 confirmed kills in the first 15 minutes. The crews were reloading as fast as they could physically manage, but there were too many Soviet tanks. For every T-34 knocked out, 3 more kept coming. The German defensive line was not deep enough to stop this kind of mass attack through attrition alone. The anti-tank guns could kill tanks. They could not kill all the tanks. Leibstandarte's panzers, positioned in hull-down firing positions behind the rail embankment, opened fire as Soviet armour closed to under 1,000 meters. Panzer IV crews had been told to hold fire until they had clear targets. The opening volleys were devastating. A platoon of T-34s attempting to cross the embankment was caught in enfilade and destroyed in under 2 minutes, but the Soviets kept advancing. A Soviet tank platoon commander with the 181st Tank Brigade, Junior Lieutenant Vasily Bryukov, described advancing through wheat so tall it obscured vision beyond 20 meters. His platoon, 5 T-34s, was supposed to follow the brigade commander's tank. In the smoke and dust, he lost sight of the lead tank within minutes. His own tank hit an anti-tank ditch concealed by wheat and threw a track. The crew bailed out under machine gun fire. Bryukov survived by hiding in the wheat for 3 hours before crawling back to Soviet lines after dark. His platoon's other 4 tanks were all destroyed. He never saw what hit them. This is when the battle started to break down. Soviet tank commanders, unable to coordinate by radio and blinded by smoke and dust, closed the range to eliminate the German gunnery advantage. Doctrine said, if you cannot fight at range, fight close. Some T-34s accelerated to maximum speed, over 50 km per hour, and drove straight at German positions. The idea was to close so fast that German gunners could not track and engage effectively. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. One Tiger crew engaged Soviet armor throughout the day's fighting. In a gunner's account recorded in the 1980s, he described the first Soviet tank he fired as simply exploding. Apparently, the round hit ammunition storage. The second T-34 lost its turret, the third caught fire but kept moving. He fired again, and the tank stopped. He stopped counting after that. Load. Aim at whatever moves, fire. Load. Aim. Fire. The fighting compartment filled with cordite smoke and empty shell casings. The noise made his ears ring for days afterward. By 0900 hours, the battlefield was covered in black smoke from burning tanks and dust thrown up by hundreds of tracks churning the dry steppe. Visibility dropped below 100 meters in many areas. Crews were firing at shapes. The noise made verbal communication inside tanks nearly impossible. Gunners relied on hand signals from commanders. Loaders worked mechanically, load, fire, without thinking. Joachim Peiper's Panzer Grenadiers, mounted in half-tracks, attempted to support the tanks by engaging Soviet infantry following behind the armor. Soviet infantry doctrine called for rifle units to advance closely behind tanks, using them as mobile cover. At Prokhorovka, this meant men on foot were trying to keep up with T-34s moving at speed across broken ground while under fire from German machine guns and artillery. The casualties were immediate and severe. One Soviet infantryman interviewed in the 1960s recalled advancing behind a T-34 when it was hit by a German round. The tank did not explode, but stopped abruptly. He ran past it and saw the driver trying to escape through his hatch. The tank was on fire inside. He kept running because stopping meant dying. He never learned if the driver got out. A sergeant in one of Piper's companies described firing an MG-42 machine gun into Soviet infantry at ranges of less than 100 meters. The Germans had positioned themselves in a small depression that provided cover from direct fire. Soviet infantry advancing across open ground toward them had no cover at all. The sergeant estimated his gun crew killed at least 30 men in the first hour of fighting. Then, Soviet tanks reached their position, and they withdrew. German infantry positions were being overrun in places where Soviet tanks simply drove through defensive lines. A T-34 weighs 26 tons. Trenches collapsed under that weight. Strongpoints were bypassed. In sector after sector, German infantry reported Soviet armor in their rear areas, while fighting was still ongoing to their front. The battle was fragmenting. Das Reich, positioned south of Leibstandarte, was engaged by the 29th Tank Corps attacking from the east. The terrain here was more open, which favoured German long-range gunnery. Das Reich tank crews reported clear fields of fire out to 2,000 metres in some areas. T-34s advancing across this ground were destroyed at range before they could close. One account describes a Soviet brigade losing over half its tanks in less than 30 minutes without inflicting a single German casualty. But the Soviets adjusted. Subsequent waves used the burning wrecks of destroyed tanks as cover, manoeuvring between them to close the range. This worked better. German crews found themselves engaging targets at ranges under 500 meters, distances where the T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate Panzer IV armor. One company commander in the Leibstandarte Panzer Regiment reported a running battle with a Soviet tank battalion that lasted over 2 hours. Divisional accounts describe a series of short-range engagements where both sides were taking losses. One of his platoon leaders, an SS Oberscharführer, was killed when his Panzer IV was hit in the side by a T-34 that had worked its way into a flanking position through a Balka. His tank exploded when the ammunition cooked off. None of the crew survived. The Germans withdrew, repositioned, and counterattacked to recover the wrecked tank. They found the Soviet tank that had killed the platoon leader destroyed less than 100 meters away, apparently by another German tank whose crew never identified themselves in the confusion. The Soviet crew had bailed out but were killed by machine gun fire before they could reach cover. This kind of confused close-range fighting was happening across the entire battlefield. Battalion from the 181st Tank Brigade hit the Leibstandarte's main defensive line around 0930 hours. Simonov's after-action report describes what happened next in clinical terms. His lead company, 10 tanks, advanced across a wheat field toward the rail embankment. German anti-tank guns destroyed 7 of the 10 tanks before they reached the embankment. The remaining 3 tanks crossed the embankment and engaged German armour at close range. One was immediately knocked out, the other 2 disappeared into the smoke. Simonov never learned what happened to them. Neither tank returned. His second company, advancing to the left of the first, had better luck. They found a gap in the anti-tank defences and pushed through, engaging German tanks from the flank. A brief, chaotic firefight followed. Simonov claimed 3 German tanks destroyed, 2 Panzer IVs and a Panzer III. Soviet losses were 4 T-34s. The survivors withdrew when they ran low on ammunition. Simonov himself remained in radio contact with his battalion for approximately 1 hour before his radio failed. After that, he commanded by hand signals and by following what other Soviet units were doing. Part of the battlefield had devolved into something resembling a mechanized brawl, more than a coordinated battle. Soviet tanks, having broken through initial defensive lines in several places, were intermingled with German armour. Unit cohesion on both sides was collapsing. Radio communication had become impossible due to atmospheric conditions, damage to equipment, and the sheer volume of transmissions overwhelming available frequencies. A Leibstandarte situation report from mid-morning, sent by motorcycle courier because radio was unreliable, stated, "Enemy tanks penetrated to battalion headquarters. Situation unclear. Request orders." The response, if any, never arrived. The battalion fought independently for the rest of the day. T-34s were ramming German tanks. This was not doctrine. This was desperation. A Soviet tank that could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour at close range could still try to damage it by collision, knock off a track, jam a turret, disable a gun. Several instances were documented. One Tiger reported damage to its main gun after a T-34 rammed its barrel while the gun was traversing. The Tiger's crew abandoned the vehicle temporarily, returned under covering fire from infantry, and found the T-34 crew had also abandoned their tank. Both vehicles were immobilized less than 10 meters apart. The German crew destroyed the T-34 with a demolition charge and then withdrew on foot. Another Tiger found itself surrounded by Soviet tanks after becoming separated from its platoon. The gunner engaged targets in a complete circle, firing, traversing, firing again. The loader was working so fast he suffered burns from handling hot shell casings. The Tiger destroyed at least 5 T-34s in close proximity before German infantry reached the position and drove off the remaining Soviet tanks. The tank had been hit 7 times. None of the hits penetrated, but the impacts had damaged the commander's cupola and vision ports. The Tiger withdrew for repairs and did not return to action that day. Infantry on both sides were suffering casualties that would only be fully counted later. Men caught between tanks had no chance. One German soldier from a Panzergrenadier company described taking cover in a shell crater and watching a T-34 drive past close enough to touch. The tank did not see him. It was hit by a Panzerfaust fired from a nearby position and exploded. Burning fuel poured into the crater. He ran. Soviet riflemen advancing with the tanks were being cut down by German machine guns and artillery. A company commander in a Soviet rifle regiment supporting 18th Tank Corps reported that his company lost 60% of its strength in the first 2 hours of fighting. Most casualties were from machine gun fire. His men were ordered to advance across open ground with minimal artillery support. German MG-42s, firing at rates of up to 1,200 rounds per minute, created beaten zones that nothing could cross. The Soviet response was to keep advancing. Officers led from the front and died first. One account from a Soviet junior sergeant describes his platoon, 32 men, ordered to clear a German strongpoint that was holding up the tank advance. They attacked across 200 meters of wheat field. German machine guns opened fire when they were halfway across. The sergeant went to ground with the survivors, 9 men. They waited for artillery support. None came. They withdrew after dark. The strongpoint was still in German hands the next morning. The smoke by mid-morning was so thick that tank commanders were fighting from closed hatches, something avoided whenever possible because it reduced visibility to almost nothing. Periscopes fogged up or were spattered with mud and oil. Gunners were aiming at muzzle flashes and engine noise. Martin Gross, commanding 2nd Abteilung of Leibstandartes Panzer Regiment, described in post-battle reports attempting to coordinate companies that had lost contact with each other. His command tank remained behind the main fighting, but even from this position he could see almost nothing through the smoke. Radio calls went unanswered. He dispatched runners, officers and NCOs in vehicles to locate his companies and issue orders verbally. Some runners never returned, others came back with contradictory reports about where friendly forces were and what the tactical situation looked like. By 10:30 hours, Gross had given up trying to coordinate at battalion level and was allowing company commanders to fight independently. This was the only realistic option. Each company became its own small battle, engaging whatever Soviet forces appeared in front of it. Soviet tank losses were mounting catastrophically. Analysis of Soviet records suggests that 5th Guards Tank Army lost approximately 300 tanks totally destroyed on July 12th, with the majority lost in the first 4 hours of fighting. Rotmistrov's staff knew the losses were severe by late morning, but the attack continued. Political pressure demanded results. German losses were lighter but significant. 2nd SS Panzer Corps reported approximately 40 to 50 tanks knocked out or damaged on July 12th. Some were total losses, others were repairable but would require days of workshop time. The critical difference was that German tanks were being destroyed or damaged on ground they held, which meant recovery was possible. Soviet tanks were burning in no man's land or behind German lines, which meant total loss. Around midday, elements of 2nd Guards Tank Corps, Rotmistrov's reserve, were committed to the fighting. These were supposed to be the exploitation force, the units that would break through once 18th and 29th Corps had smashed the German defences. Instead, they were thrown into a stalled offensive to prevent complete failure. Major General Berdini's corps attacked toward the same killing grounds that had already consumed 2 Soviet tank corps. Berdini had approximately 150 tanks. His orders were to break through the German line and advance toward Prokhorovka itself. The orders made no sense given what had already happened, but orders were orders. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps attack began around 1200 hours. By this point, German anti-tank defences were well prepared and had clear fields of fire across ground littered with Soviet tank wrecks. Berdini's leading brigades were engaged immediately. One brigade commander later reported losing 30 tanks in the first 20 minutes of the attack. His brigade advanced less than 500 meters before being forced to withdraw. The result was more burning tanks. One Soviet tank brigade commander, in an account preserved by Soviet military historians, described receiving orders to attack through a wheat field already littered with destroyed vehicles. His brigade had 32 tanks. They advanced in line abreast as doctrine required. German anti-tank guns engaged from concealed positions. He lost 8 tanks before reaching the German line. His own tank was hit, but remained mobile. He ordered a withdrawal. He was relieved of command 2 days later for failing to achieve his objective. Soviet accounts from survivors describe a battlefield that looked like an industrial scrapyard, burning tanks everywhere. Smoke so thick you couldn't see the sun, the smell of burning fuel and flesh. Bodies of tank crewmen who had bailed out and been cut down by machine gun fire. Wounded men screaming. The noise, constant, overwhelming, making thought impossible. A T-34 driver with the 29th Tank Corps, interviewed decades later, described his tank being hit by German fire around noon. The shell penetrated the hull and killed the commander and gunner instantly. The driver and loader escaped through the bottom hatch. They ran toward Soviet lines through smoke, jumping over bodies and tank wrecks. They made it back. The driver never got into another tank. He was reassigned to infantry and survived the war. By early afternoon, the offensive had lost all momentum. Soviet units were still attacking in places, but these were isolated efforts by individual battalions or companies who had not received orders to stop. The coordinated mass assault Rotmistrov had planned was over. While Leibstandarte and Das Reich were engaged south of Prokhorovka, Totenkopf was fighting a separate battle north of the Psel River. The terrain here was marshy and cut by streams. Routes of advance were limited. Soviet defenders, elements of 5th Guards Army under Lieutenant General Zhadov, were dug in along the southern bank of the river with clear fields of fire. Totenkopf's mission was to cross the Psel, envelope Soviet positions from the north, and link up with Leibstandarte advancing from the south. This would trap Soviet forces in a pocket west of Prokhorovka. It was a sound operational concept that ignored the ground. German engineers attempted to bridge the river under fire. Soviet artillery and mortar fire destroyed the first 2 bridges. A third crossing was established by midday, but it could only handle 1 vehicle at a time. Totenkopf tanks crossed in single file while Soviet guns targeted the bridgehead. SS Sturmbannführer Karl Ulrich, commanding a Panzergrenadier battalion in Totenkopf, led his men across the river on foot and attempted to establish a defensive perimeter on the far bank. Ulrich had received the Knight's Cross in April 1943, for actions near Kharkov, not for anything at Prokhorovka. His battalion secured the bridgehead but could not advance further. Soviet counterattacks throughout the afternoon forced Totenkopf to fight defensively just to hold the crossing. Ulrich's battalion spent most of July 12th under Soviet artillery fire. One account from an NCO in his battalion describes being pinned down in a shallow depression while Soviet mortars ranged in on their position. Casualties mounted. The battalion's medics ran out of morphine by early afternoon. Wounded men had to be evacuated across the single bridge under fire. A slow, costly process. The battalion lost over 40 men killed or wounded on July 12th without achieving any territorial gain. One account from a Totenkopf tank commander describes manoeuvring through a swamp where the ground could not support the tank's weight. His Panzer IV sank to the top of its tracks. The crew abandoned it and returned to friendly lines on foot, under fire, wading through waist-deep water. The tank was not recovered until 3 days later, by which point the engine and transmission were ruined. Total write-off. By evening on July 12th, Totenkopf had advanced approximately 2 kilometers beyond the Psel. This was nowhere near enough to threaten Soviet rear areas or link up with Leibstandarte. The offensive north of the river had failed. Soviet defenders north of the Psel, under the command of Lieutenant General Zhadov, had received orders to hold at all costs. Zhadov's 5th Guards Army was an infantry formation, not tanks, but it included substantial artillery and anti-tank assets. His after-action reports described German attempts to cross the Psel as persistent but ultimately contained. One Soviet anti-tank gun commander positioned his 76mm ZS-3 gun in a tree line overlooking the Psel crossing. His gun crew engaged German armour crossing the river, claiming 3 tank kills during the day. He was later awarded the Order of the Red Star, a mid-level decoration for his actions on July 12th. His gun was destroyed by German counter-battery fire late in the afternoon, but by then Totenkopf's attack had stalled. The fighting north of the Psel continued on 13 and 14 July as Totenkopf attempted to expand its bridgehead. These attacks achieved minimal gains at high cost. By 15th July, the division was ordered to withdraw back across the river and consolidate with the rest of 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Effective higher-level command largely broke down by mid-morning on July 12th. Paul Hauser, at 2nd SS Panzer Corps headquarters, had no reliable information about what was happening at the front. Radio reports were fragmentary and often contradictory. Motorcycle couriers were taking hours to reach forward units and return. The few Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights that managed to penetrate Soviet air defences reported heavy fighting and many burning vehicles, but could not provide useful tactical details through the smoke. Rotmistrov, at 5th Guards Tank Army headquarters, was in similar circumstances. He knew his units were taking severe losses because tank strength reports, sent by landline when available, showed numbers dropping throughout the morning. He did not know where his units were, what they had achieved, or whether continuing the attack made any tactical sense. He continued ordering attacks because stopping would mean admitting failure. At 11:30 hours, Rotmistrov received a telephone call from Marshal Nikolai Vatutin, commanding Voronezh front. Vatutin demanded to know the status of the attack. Rotmistrov reportedly replied that the attack was developing and that German tank forces were being destroyed. This was not true. Vatutin knew it was not true, but Rotmistrov had no other answer to give. At division and brigade level, commanders were fighting blind. A Das Reich regimental commander described the situation in his war diary as completely unclear. He knew Soviet tanks were somewhere to his front. He knew his own tanks were engaging them. He did not know how many Soviet tanks there were, where they were going, or what they were trying to achieve. He ordered his units to continue engaging enemy armour because there was nothing else to order. Soviet brigade and battalion commanders had even less information. Many had lost contact with higher headquarters. Some were making decisions based on what they could see from their own tank, which, in heavy smoke, was often less than 50 meters. Attack, withdraw, or hold position became individual choices made by men who had no idea what was happening 100 meters to their left or right. This fragmentation is why casualty figures for Prokhorovka are so difficult to establish with precision. Units lost track of their own strength. Companies reported tanks destroyed that were later recovered. Other tanks, listed as damaged, were actually total losses. The chaos made accurate reporting impossible in real time, and post-battle assessments were often politically influenced. What is clear from German records is that, by mid-afternoon, 2nd SS Panzer Corps had stopped advancing and gone defensive. Leibstandarte and Das Reich units pulled back to consolidate positions and recover damaged vehicles. This was not a retreat, it was a recognition that offensive operations were no longer possible. Soviet forces continued attacking in places until evening, but these were uncoordinated efforts. Some brigades attacked because they had not received orders to stop. Others attacked because their commanders believed incorrectly that one more push would break the German line. It did not. A Soviet tank battalion commander with 18th Tank Corps described ordering his remaining tanks, 7 out of 31, to attack a German position late in the afternoon. He believed the Germans were withdrawing and that one final push would open a breakthrough. His tanks advanced. They were engaged by German anti-tank guns and panzers from prepared positions. He lost 4 more tanks in 15 minutes. He ordered the survivors to withdraw. His battalion was pulled off the line that evening, having effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. By nightfall on July 12th, the fighting around Prokhorovka had largely ended. Both sides held roughly the same ground they had occupied that morning. Hundreds of tanks were burning or abandoned across the battlefield. Wounded men were still being recovered, and no one, German or Soviet, had a clear picture of what had actually happened. Paul Hauser's report to 4th Panzer Army headquarters, dated 13th in July, stated that 2nd SS Panzer Corps had repelled a major enemy armoured attack and inflicted heavy losses on Soviet forces. The report estimated Soviet tank losses at over 200 vehicles. It also noted that German tank strength had been reduced by approximately 15%, and that continuation of offensive operations toward Kursk was not feasible without reinforcement and resupply. Hauser did not claim victory. He reported a successful defense followed by operational paralysis. The detailed strength reports from 2nd SS Panzer Corps divisions compiled on July 13th provide specific numbers. Leibstandarte reported approximately 40 tanks lost or damaged, with roughly half repairable within 1 week. Das Reich reported approximately 35 tanks lost or damaged. Totenkopf reported approximately 20. These numbers represent confirmed losses and do not include tanks temporarily out of action due to minor damage or mechanical problems. Infantry casualties across the Corps were significant but less catastrophic than tank losses. Leibstandarte Panzer Grenadier battalions reported combined casualties of approximately 120 men killed or wounded. Das Reich reported similar numbers. Totenkopf's casualties were higher, over 200, due to the difficult fighting north of the Psel. Rotmistrov's report to Stavka was more complicated. Soviet operational summaries from 13th July claimed 5th Guards Tank Army had smashed enemy tank formations and prevented the enemy from achieving his objectives. The language was carefully chosen. Rotmistrov did not claim to have destroyed 2nd SS Panzer Corps, he claimed to have stopped it. This was true. He also reported his own losses, though the numbers were understated. Initial figures suggested approximately 50% tank losses, roughly 400 vehicles. Later assessments would revise this upward. What Rotmistrov did not report immediately was that many of his formations were combat ineffective and would require weeks to reconstitute. A more detailed accounting came later. Soviet archival documents released in the 1990s show that 5th Guards Tank Army reported 334 tanks totally destroyed on July 12th, with an additional 400 plus damaged to varying degrees. Of the damaged tanks, approximately half would eventually be returned to service. This meant that Rotmistrov had effectively lost over 500 tanks, more than half his strength in a single day. 18th Tank Corps, which had borne the brunt of the fighting against Leibstandarte, was reduced to fewer than 50 operational tanks by the evening of July 12th. 29th Tank Corps was in slightly better shape, approximately 60 operational tanks, but still combat ineffective as a formation. 2nd Guards Tank Corps, committed late in the battle, lost approximately 100 tanks. Stalin's response was pragmatic. Rotmistrov was not relieved or punished. The attack had achieved its strategic purpose. It had forced the Germans to stop advancing. Whether this was worth the losses was not a question Stalin asked publicly. Rotmistrov would remain in command of 5th Guards Tank Army and would later participate in the liberation of Ukraine and the advance into Poland. German divisional after-action reports provide more detail on the fighting. Leibstandarte's report describes the Soviet attack as poorly coordinated but executed with fanatical determination. It notes that Soviet tanks closed a point-blank range despite heavy casualties, and that fighting became confused and difficult to control. The report praises the performance of German anti-tank gun crews and Tiger tank commanders, but acknowledges that the division's offensive capability was temporarily exhausted. Das Reich's report is similar, though it notes that the division's sector saw less intense fighting than Leibstandarte's. Soviet attacks in Das Reich's sector were repelled with moderate German casualties, and German tank losses were acceptable given the number of enemy tanks destroyed. The report concludes that the division remains capable of limited offensive operations, but recommends defensive posture until reinforcements arrive. Totenkopf's report is the most pessimistic. It describes the fighting north of the Psel as tactically successful, but operationally meaningless. The division achieved local gains, but could not exploit them. The report notes that further offensive operations in this sector are not recommended due to terrain conditions and strong enemy defences. Medical services on both sides were overwhelmed. German field hospitals treated hundreds of wounded tankers and infantrymen on July 12th to 13th. Soviet medical units were in worse condition, with insufficient supplies and personnel to handle the volume of casualties. One Soviet medical officer's account describes amputating limbs without anesthesia because supplies had run out. The dead were counted later. German burial details recovered approximately 200 bodies from the immediate battlefield over the following week. Soviet burial teams working in areas that remained contested recovered over 600 in the same period. These numbers are incomplete. Many bodies were never recovered, some burned beyond identification inside destroyed tanks. Prokhorovka was not the largest tank battle in history. That distinction belongs to the Battle of Brody in June 1941, where over 3,500 Soviet and German tanks were engaged across multiple sectors over several days. Prokhorovka involved roughly 700 to 900 Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns, and approximately 280 to 320 German tanks and assault guns in direct combat on a single day. This is still massive, but the numbers cited in popular accounts, often claiming over 1,500 tanks participating, are inflated. The myth of Prokhorovka as a clean Soviet victory emerged during the Cold War. Soviet historians working under political constraints portrayed the battle as a decisive defeat of German armoured forces that turned the tide on the Eastern Front. This narrative served propaganda purposes but ignored the tactical reality. Soviet losses were catastrophic, and the attack failed to destroy or even severely damage 2nd SS Panzer Corps as a fighting formation. What the Soviets did achieve was operational success. By forcing the Germans onto the defensive and imposing unsustainable attrition, Rotmistrov's attack contributed to the broader failure of Operation Citadel. German forces could not advance because they lacked the strength to overcome continuing Soviet resistance. This was not because of Prokhorovka specifically, it was because of cumulative losses across the entire Kursk salient over 9 days of fighting, but Prokhorovka became the symbolic moment. German accounts written after the war emphasized tactical success and kill ratios. These accounts are not wrong, but they miss the operational context. Destroying 3 or 4 Soviet tanks for every German tank lost is meaningless if you cannot replace your losses and the enemy can. Germany's strategic position in 1943 was that every tank mattered. The Soviet position was that losses were acceptable if they achieved results. Prokhorovka looked like a Soviet defeat at the tactical level. Soviet tank losses were at least 3 to 4 times higher than German losses. Soviet units were forced to withdraw or stop attacking. The Germans held the battlefield and recovered their damaged vehicles. German commanders reported success, but at the operational level, Prokhorovka was a Soviet success. It stopped the German advance, it imposed delays and losses that prevented exploitation. It contributed to Hitler's decision announced on July 13th to hold Citadel and redirect forces to deal with the Allied landings in Sicily and anticipated Soviet offensives elsewhere on the Eastern Front. And at the strategic level, Prokhorovka was irrelevant. The outcome of the war was not decided here. The Eastern Front would continue for nearly 2 more years, with battles far larger and bloodier than Prokhorovka. What mattered was that Germany had launched its last major strategic offensive in the East and failed to achieve decisive results. Everything that followed was reaction and retreat. Historians still argue about the details. Glantz and House, in their comprehensive analysis of Kursk, emphasize that Prokhorovka was one engagement in a much larger defensive operation, and that focusing on it exclusively distorts understanding of the battle. They argue that Soviet losses at Prokhorovka were severe, but that the broader defensive operation around Kursk was remarkably well executed. Zetterling and Frankson argue that Soviet losses were even higher than traditionally acknowledged, and that the engagement was a tactical disaster saved only by strategic context. Their analysis of Soviet archival documents suggests that Rotmistrov's attack achieved nothing that could not have been achieved by a well-executed defensive battle at far lower cost. Nipe's work on 2nd SS Panzer Corps provides the most detailed German perspective, though it sometimes overstates German effectiveness. Nipe argues that 2nd SS Panzer Corps was never in danger of being destroyed at Prokhorovka, and that Soviet numerical superiority was largely negated by superior German tactics, training and equipment. What is not disputed is that the fighting on July 12, 1943 was brutal, confused, and far more complicated than simplified narratives suggest. The kill ratio debate is particularly contentious. German records suggest they destroyed 300 to 400 Soviet tanks on July 12th, while losing approximately 40 to 50 of their own, estimates that remain debated. Soviet records acknowledge 334 total tank losses, with another 400 plus damaged. The discrepancy comes from how destroyed is defined. A tank with a thrown track that can be recovered and repaired is different from a tank that burned to the hull. Both might be counted as destroyed in after-action reports. The terrain also complicates assessment. Most Soviet tank losses occurred in no man's land or behind German lines, meaning they could not be recovered. Most German tank losses occurred on ground the Germans held, meaning recovery and repair was possible. This created a situation where German tank strength recovered relatively quickly while Soviet tank strength did not. Awards and recognition followed the battle, though not always for the right reasons. Michael Wittmann, the Leibstandarte Tiger commander, would eventually receive the Knight's Cross with oak leaves for his cumulative achievements as a tank ace, with over 100 Soviet tanks officially credited to him by war's end. His most famous action, destroying multiple British tanks near Villers-Bocage in Normandy on June 13, 1944, would come a year later. Wittmann's Knight's Cross was awarded in January 1944 for actions throughout the latter half of 1943, including but not limited to Prokhorovka. Franz Staudegger had been awarded the Knight's Cross shortly thereafter for earlier actions during Citadel, specifically his extraordinary action on the 8th of July near Teterovino, during the early advance phase of the operation where his Tiger crew destroyed 22 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. He was the first Tiger tank commander to receive the decoration. Joachim Peiper received the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross on the 27th of January 1944. The award recognised his overall performance during Citadel and subsequent operations, not a single action. Peiper's reputation was built on aggressive leadership and tactical skill, but also on ruthlessness that would later result in war crimes charges related to the Malmedy massacre in December 1944. His role at Prokhorovka was competent battalion command under difficult conditions. Helmut Becker, the Totenkopf company commander, received the Knight's Cross in September 1943 for cumulative actions during the summer fighting, including the Psel crossing operation. His citation specifically mentions leadership under fire and destruction of enemy tanks in difficult terrain. Martin Gross received the Knight's Cross on 22 July 1943, specifically for his battalion's actions at Prokhorovka on 12 July. The citation recognised Gross's leadership of two: Abteilung under extremely difficult conditions, and the battalion's effectiveness in defensive operations against overwhelming Soviet armoured attacks. Rudolf von Ribbentrop received the Knight's Cross in mid-July 1943 for his company's actions during the fighting. The award recognised his effective command and tactical skill during the intense combat south of the town. On the Soviet side, Rotmistrov retained his command and was later promoted. His handling of 5th Guards tank army at Prokhorovka was questionable. Hasty planning, poor coordination, enormous losses, but the strategic outcome mattered more than tactical execution. He received the Order of Suvorov Second Class, though not specifically for Prokhorovka. Rotmistrov would go on to command tank armies through the liberation of Ukraine into Poland and ultimately into Germany itself. Lower-ranking Soviet officers and men who distinguished themselves in the fighting received various awards, though documentation is sparse. Pavel Rotmistrov's staff recommended numerous decorations immediately after the battle. Operationally, Prokhorovka marked the end of German offensive capability at Kursk. Hitler formally suspended Citadel on 13th of July, citing the need to redirect forces to Italy following the Allied invasion of Sicily on 10th July. This was partly true, the Mediterranean situation was deteriorating, but it was also a convenient excuse to halt an operation that had already failed. Some units continued fighting for several more days, but these were defensive actions or local counterattacks, not part of a coherent offensive plan. 4th Panzer Army and 2nd SS Panzer Corps began preparing for withdrawal and redeployment. Soviet forces did not immediately exploit the German halt. 5th Guards Tank Army required reconstitution. 18th Tank Corps was down to fewer than 40 operational tanks by July 14th. 29th Tank Corps had approximately 50. These formations were pulled off the line and sent to rear areas for refitting. Replacement tanks began arriving within days, but rebuilding combat effectiveness would take weeks. Other Soviet formations around Kursk were exhausted from 9 days of defensive fighting. It would take until July 17th to 18th before the Red Army launched coordinated counteroffensives across the salient. When those counteroffensives began, they were massive, multiple fronts attacking simultaneously with objectives including the liberation of Oryol to the north and Belgorod to the south. What followed Kursk is well known. Soviet offensives that pushed German forces back across Ukraine, the liberation of Kharkov in August, the advance to the Dnieper by autumn. Prokhorovka's role in this was indirect. It did not destroy German armour, it did not open a breakthrough, it imposed enough cost and delay to contribute to operational failure which enabled strategic Soviet success. Whether the losses were justified depends on perspective. From Stalin's viewpoint, losing over 500 tanks to stop a German offensive threatening Kursk was acceptable. The Soviet Union could replace tanks faster than Germany. Losing men and machines while grinding down German strength was strategically sound, even if tactically costly. From Rotmistrov's viewpoint, following orders and surviving politically required accepting those losses. He had been given an impossible task: destroy an elite German formation in a hasty attack across terrible terrain with inadequate preparation, and he had accomplished the only realistic objective, forcing the Germans to stop. His career survived. From the perspective of Soviet tank crews burning to death in T-34s, justification was irrelevant. They followed orders, attacked as doctrine required, and died in numbers that would have been unacceptable to any Western army. But the Red Army in 1943 was not a Western army. It operated under different assumptions about acceptable casualties. German forces at Prokhorovka destroyed more tanks than they lost, held the ground, and maintained unit cohesion. From a tactical standpoint, they won. But tactical success without operational or strategic benefit is Pyrrhic. 2nd SS Panzer Corps finished 12th of July, capable of defensive operations but incapable of continuing the offensive. That was enough to fail. The broader context matters. Prokhorovka was not an isolated battle. It was part of Operation Citadel, which was itself part of the larger struggle for the Eastern Front. German losses at Prokhorovka, estimated at 40 to 50 tanks, 150 casualties, were not catastrophic in isolation, but combined with losses across the entire Kursk salient over 9 days, hundreds of tanks, thousands of men, they represented attrition Germany could not sustain. Soviet losses at Prokhorovka were catastrophic in isolation, over 500 tanks, perhaps 1,500 casualties. But the Red Army could absorb these losses because reserves were available and production was increasing. By late 1943, Soviet tank production exceeded German production by a ratio of approximately 4-1. Losing tanks was expensive. Not stopping the Germans would have been worse. A Totenkopf situation report dated 15th of July 1943 contains the following line. Battlefield reconnaissance indicates 191 enemy tank wrecks counted in sector, own losses, 11 total write-offs, 23 repairable, fuel status, critical, ammunition status, adequate, personnel, exhausted, further offensive action not recommended. That was Prokhorovka, not the largest tank battle in history, not a decisive Soviet victory, not a crushing German defeat. Just another day on the Eastern Front where thousands of men fought, hundreds died, and the war ground on without resolution. The battlefield went quiet on July 13th. Salvage crews began their work, the wounded were evacuated, the dead were buried, and within days, both armies were fighting again somewhere else.